Everyone here this morning, and just want to make mention in our Bible class, we mentioned Psalm 122 and verse 1 regarding the rejoicing that took place concerning David being able to go up into the house of the Lord. And I mentioned, for example, 10 generations and the inability to assemble with God's people. I didn't make mention of the source for that, so I just wanted to do that now. It's Deuteronomy 23 and verse 2. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 2, and if you look at the generational history of David, and you go all the way back to Tamar, for example, then you begin to see exactly what David was referring to there in Psalm 122 and verse 1. I hope you can join our Sunday morning Bible studies. Our eldership has been very diligent to encourage us all to attend a Bible class. We have a great opportunity to study some material written by our brother Stephen Rogers, looking at the simplicity of the gospel and the power of it, and the way in which we can further fortify our understanding of the gospel, and also be prepared and be able to teach those around us and be able to convict them and convince them of the truth. You are hopefully praying, thinking about, and preparing for what we looked at and studied together last Sunday. And you are focusing in, I hope, on someone that you can teach the gospel to, someone that you can convert to the Lord. I hope you're praying about that individual, thinking about that individual, looking for open doors, creating open doors for that individual so that they might have the hope of heaven. Hopefully you are identifying and thinking about and praying about. If you haven't identified yet, hopefully you're looking to identify someone that you can encourage and train, that can be somewhat, you can be a mentor to them. They can be somewhat of an apprentice toward you. It doesn't have to be official. It doesn't have to be known. But it's something that hopefully you can be working toward, praying toward. And hopefully there is someone that you are aware of in this congregation that is going astray, that is no longer assembling with us on a regular basis, that hopefully you're praying about, thinking about. If you're not reaching out to yet, hopefully you're getting ready to and thinking about how you can reach out to them. And then hopefully you're thinking of ways as to how you can find further instruction, further education, knowledge, and understanding regarding areas of your life that you need to have corrected, or that you need to be fortified so that you can push away the temptations that are coming upon you. We have the correction box. It's sitting back here in the teacher workroom. It's a blue box. It's written there on permanent marker, correction box, instructions as to what you can do. Again, this is an opportunity for you, unknowingly to the preacher or to anyone else, to have lessons specifically focused on areas that you need to work on in your spiritual life. And this morning what we're going to do is we're going to study one of those very areas, one of those very submissions into the correction box, as to how we can be at better peace. At better peace. You know, peace is something that we all struggle with. Peace and being at peace is something that can be difficult and complicated and complex to obtain. We recognize that peace is something that is inclusive of one of the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. It is something that we should be longing for, something that we should be seeking to obtain and live in. But it is certainly something that doesn't just find a point at which we are then in a state of peace and then we're locked in and we don't need to think about it any longer, and we're just going to be at peace for the rest of our life. It isn't a, I've gained it once and now I'm good to go type scenario, but it's something that we're constantly dealing with. And this morning we're going to study why we struggle to have peace and how we can remain in a state of peace. First of all, one of the reasons why we struggle with peace is our very understanding of what peace is. You know, the world tries to tell us all kinds of ideas regarding peace and regarding the antithesis of peace, which is conflict. We see all throughout our media channels, school shootings, riots, terrorist attacks, theater shootings, children throughout the world who are starving because of oppression, nations that are planning, plotting, and threatening war. We have workplace shootings. We have conflicts with our bosses, conflicts with our neighbors, conflicts with our friends, conflicts with our family members. We have a whole lot of conflict out there, and therefore there is a great deal of interest to find peace so that this conflict can be alleviated. This is the world's mantra. This is the world's understanding. And oftentimes, this is how we begin to understand and think about peace. And regarding our environment and regarding these relationships that we have with individuals, regarding our understanding of maybe peace when it comes to freedom from conflict of persecution or maybe monetary challenges, we see peace referenced and we see it referred to in the Scripture in that way as well. And let's begin by looking at that. Let's look at types of peace that are found in the Bible. First, we see that there are examples of peace with self. Examples of peace with self. For example, there's psychological peace. Psychological peace. Being at peace with our psyche. Being mentally stable. For example, Romans chapter 8 and verse 6, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. And so we recognize that there's one mindset that's going to lead unto death, and there's another mindset, another psychological way of living that's going to lead unto life and peace. There is physical peace. Physical peace. Jesse sent David to carry food to the fighting men of Israel, and it was commanded there, look how thy brethren fare. 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 18. The very word shalom, in other words, look how thy brethren have peace. Look at whether or not they are at peace. Look at the peace that exists or does not exist with them. It has to do with, oftentimes, physical health. How is their physical health? How is their physical well-being? Physically speaking, how are they faring? How are they doing? There is marital peace, or material peace rather. Material peace. Which includes marital peace oftentimes. Psalm 122 and verse 7, peace be within thy walls and prosperity within thy palaces. And so the idea that materially speaking, we are at peace, we are able to be fortified, we're able to be protected. Luke chapter 11 and verse 21, when a strong man armed keepeth his palace, his goods are in peace. In other words, he's being protected from the conflict that could come upon his home because he is physically fortified, materially able to be at peace. We understand being financially at peace. Financially at peace, being in a state of completeness regarding our material needs. And these verses indicate such examples. So there's peace with self exemplified throughout Scripture. There's also peace with the environment. Peace with the environment. There's social peace. God said to Gideon in Judges chapter 6 and verse 23, peace be unto thee. Jethro said to Moses, and Jonathan said to David, go in peace. Exodus chapter 4 and verse 18, 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 42. It's essentially saying, hope you're doing well, or how are you doing? Go in peace. Paul used in the beginning of almost all of his letters except Hebrews, if we're going to attribute Hebrews with Paul, he's oftentimes giving a salutation of peace. This was used by Peter, it was used by John, it was used by Jude. Also, there is political peace. Political peace. So we have social peace. We also have political peace. Reference to a nation being free from conflict. Joshua chapter 9 and verse 15, for example. Joshua made peace with them, that is the Gibeonites, and made a league with them going against the instructions of God. So here he's trying to find political peace. He's disobeying God in order to have political peace with the Gibeonites. He's having a pact or a treaty to not enter into conflict. Tyre and Sidon desired peace with Herod because they needed Palestinian resources. Note Acts chapter 12 in verse 20. We think about the account of Jesus, for example, weeping over Jerusalem because he knew their present peace would end when Rome came to destroy the city. Note Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44. So the environmental type of peace that we can have includes social, it includes political, but it also includes spiritual in reference to the inner man. We have spiritual peace and the ability to obtain it throughout the Old Testament law. For example, God commanded sacrifices, peace offerings in Leviticus chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. Psalm chapter 37 and verse 37, mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is Peace, so the one that is living in a completed fashion, in an upright fashion according to the commandments of God. The end of that man, the goal or finality of that man is to obtain peace. Peace was sought and looked for between God and man. It is something that we today, the world today, although they may not realize that's what they're looking for, but it's how peace, ultimate peace, can be obtained. Look with me in Psalm 34. Psalm 34. And let's look here beginning at verse 9. Oh, fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. Well, we could stop right there and spend a great deal of time just on these two passages. You know, oftentimes the reason why we are struggling to be at peace is because we are not fixated on fearing the Lord. We're not fixated on upholding God's commandments, but rather we're fixated on how we can go out and consume and obtain more things, and we're comparing ourselves constantly with other individuals, with friends, with peers, and we're noticing all the things that they have, and we recognize that we don't have them, and so we're at a point of conflict. I'm lacking something here. There's something wrong with me. There's something that I need to go get and go obtain, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it, and so therefore I'm stressed out, I'm overwhelmed, I'm depressed, because I'm no good. Folks, there was a study that came out last week, maybe you came across it, that millennials are depressed. Shocking to me when you think about how spoiled, and I'll unfortunately have to include myself in that generation, millennials are compared to previous generations. Previous generations that fought in multiple wars, saved the world multiple times, went through depressions, had 1/100th of the conveniences that we have in this generation. Yet those generations were happy as could be. And the millennial generation is depressed. And psychologists have studied, researchers, scientists have studied, trying to figure out why. Well, I think we can understand why. The impact and the penetration of technology in our lives and the ability to socially scan the world and see anyone we want to see and their status and what they're doing at any time. And so the constant and continual comparisons that we are making with those around us and then telling ourselves that we aren't perfect in the way the world would define it. We're not cutting it. We have a whole lot of lack in our life, and then we recognize the inability to obtain and achieve that, and it causes stress, and it causes depression, and it causes a lack of peace. The psalmist states here, fear the Lord. There is no want to them that fear him. Goes on, let's look at verse 11. Come ye children, hearken unto me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is he that desireth life and loveth many days, that he may see good? Keep thy tongue from evil, and thy lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. Folks, God is saying there are certain folks that are just not in a right relationship with him, and those who are in such a state are going to be cut off. And that we, those that are interested in biblical peace, are to be pursuing it. In other words, the very interest to study this topic, the very interest to find out more about peace and how we can have it, is right in line with what God is telling us. It is something that we should be pursuing. Folks, it's not just something that just lands in our lap one day and we just say, oh, now everything's just great and wonderful and so I'm at peace. No, but it is pursued. And it's capable of being obtained when we recognize what type of peace it is that we should be trying to find and live in. We see in the very beginning of the Bible that peace was lost. Peace was lost. When God created the heaven and the earth, He looked upon creation and saw that it was very good. Chapter 1 there of Genesis, verse 31. Man had been created and had a special relationship with God. God created man in God's own image. Chapter 1 there, verses 26 and 27. Man had direct access to God. He heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of day. Chapter 3 and verse 8. God placed man in a garden of paradise called Eden and gave man a companion, Eve. At this very moment, when God first created the world, everything literally was in a perfect state of peace. And they both were naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25. Peace existed with self. Peace existed with the environment. In all cases, there was total and complete peace, even physically and materially speaking. But that did not last. And we know why. It didn't last because they transgressed the law of God. Chapter 2 there, verse 17. They partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God had commanded them not to partake of. Therefore, they had sinned. They had transgressed God's law. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. And therefore, that inner peace was utterly shattered. And we see as Adam and Eve are recognizing what it is that they've done, and are coming to terms with the consequences of their decision. Verse 7 there of chapter 3, and the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. They recognized that they were no longer in a state of complete peace that they had once been in. Their external peace then therefore ceased when God had removed them from the garden. Chapter 3 and verse 24. Ultimately, sin had caused the relationship that had existed in the beginning with God to no longer exist in that same form. Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. It's not because of God. His hand is not slack. His ear is not incapable of hearing us. But when we choose to forsake Him, we then leave that state that we are able or could have with God. And so many conflicts, therefore, came about because of this decision by Adam and Eve. And the material piece, the physical piece, began to crumble. They were removed from the garden. Maritally, obviously, they began to have issues. Adam begins to blame his wife. They begin to blame God. They begin to find themselves now in a situation where they're no longer cared for, and they're no longer being protected from the harshness and the difficulties that exist in the world, having been removed from the garden. And so these types of circumstances continue to exist today. Hence, we have the challenges that we do have. And so what is the world's solution as to how we can alleviate these complications and these types of conflicts? Well, the world says when it comes to political peace, it can be obtained by treaties, pacts, agreements. Hey, let's just try to avoid war altogether. Let's just completely eliminate the possibility of war. Let's just say that there's going to be a way to just never let terrorists do what they want to do. Well, how does that work out? Are we successful in that regard? No. We continue to have challenges and we continue to have complications regarding the efforts to obtain a complete and total political peace. Material peace. Folks say, well, if you have wealth, you have peace. If you want to be at peace materially, just go out and get as much money as you possibly can, and then once you go obtain all this money, then you'll finally be at peace. Well, folks, it's oftentimes the very opposite. The more and more we go out and try to obtain and obtain and obtain, just like we looked at Psalm 34 a few minutes ago, the more and more we realize, you know what? I just can never obtain enough. And the more at conflict we actually become. Then there's an attempt to create psychological peace. I've done some work in therapy and so forth, and the idea is that let folks just vent and ramble and try to boost their self-esteem and tell them how wonderful they are. Don't tell them that homosexuality is wrong. Don't tell them that getting drunk and avoiding their marital responsibilities, their responsibilities to their children is wrong. Don't tell them that they need to uphold the various roles that they have agreed upon and put themselves in. Don't tell them that to avoid such as wrong, but rather just boost them up and tell them how wonderful and great they are. And then they'll have psychological peace. Well, folks, we have a generation who's been raised that way. And they are more confused than probably any other previous generation in this country has ever been. Because all they've been told their whole life is how wonderful they are, but yet they still can't seem to find psychological peace, and they're in more need of therapists than any other previous generation. There's an attempt to create spiritual peace. Well, just go find enlightened paths. Go out east somewhere. Go walk the trails of Asia and learn about Buddha. And go watch Joel Osteen hold up his Bible and then never quote a verse. And if you do that, then you can find spiritual peace. Folks, the world's attempts to alleviate the conflict that we have is physically minded. And it's based upon a principle and a core that if we can just fix the physical, then we can find peace. And folks, that's not the kind of peace that we yearn for. That's not the kind of peace that God commands us to have, and that's not the kind of peace that the gospel offers. The gospel is not the prosperity gospel, physically speaking. It is spiritual. Peace can be found eternally in God. God is the God of peace. Romans chapter 15 and verse 33. As a matter of fact, He is the author of peace. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 33. Jesus Christ is the Prince of Peace. Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. The gospel of peace is offered unto man. And it is through the gospel that mankind can then finally be at peace. It is referred to as the gospel of peace. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 15. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 9. Obedience to the gospel yields peace. Paul writes, those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me do, and the God of peace shall be with you. Folks, if we want to have peace, the answer is not to totally and completely remove ourselves from conflict. That's not the answer. As a matter of fact, if we think of peace in that way, oftentimes we're not going to allow ourselves to embrace, obey, and live in the gospel. Because guess what obeying and living in the gospel brings about? Oftentimes, conflict in these other areas of life. But if we seek peace in the gospel, by upholding and living in the gospel, obeying the gospel, then, yes, we're going to be in conflict oftentimes in many other areas in our life. But we're going to be at complete and total peace with God, which is where peace can only be found. Jesus explains this in what we call the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Jesus states there in verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. See, peace itself is a paradox. Biblical peace is a paradox. You would think then, after verse 9, we would then read that those who are peacemakers are going to have everything taken care of physically, financially. Their environment is all going to be well. Their marriages are going to be perfect. Their family is going to love them for upholding the gospel of peace. They're never going to have any conflict with their friends or neighbors or difficulties in their life. But that's not how the verses continue. Verse 10, Jesus states, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Wait a second. So if I'm a peacemaker, I'm going to be persecuted? Yes, physically you're going to have conflict. Verse 11, blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Wait a second. So when I'm a peacemaker, when I'm living in the gospel of peace, there are going to be those who hate me and despise me and don't like me? Yes. Verse 12, rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Yes, indeed, living in the gospel of peace, it may seem as though your whole life you're in conflict with all these other areas and channels. But by abiding in the Lord's will and by furthering His work and His mission in this life, you are aligning yourself with those who are faithful, who have gone on before. You are aligning yourself with the Lord and His faithful servants. So the question is for us this morning, are we at peace? Now it depends upon how we're going to ask that question. Physically speaking, it's been a great deal. We started off the announcements. Flip just kept reading off the names. I mean, so many folks, health-wise, not at peace. Maybe you're not at peace health-wise this morning. Maybe you know deep down you got bills to pay, you got responsibilities to take care of, and financially, monetarily speaking, it doesn't seem like you're at peace. Maybe when it comes to your job and it comes to your career, boss man doesn't like anything you have to say, and it just seems like you're going to be going in the opposite direction rather than being promoted for a very long time. Doesn't seem like you're at peace. Maybe your family situation, as you're striving to live according to the Lord's will, you just find your family becoming more and more irritated and upset and angry with you in your efforts to live and cleave to God. Doesn't seem like you're at peace. That may be the case for many of us here. As a matter of fact, most of us probably would raise our hand and say, no, there's something physically in conflict, wrong with my life right now. But guess what? You can still have peace. Peace that passes understanding. In other words, it's almost impossible to comprehend because all of what's around us seems like complete and total chaos. But you know what? We're right with the Lord. And so we're at ease and we're at peace. Brother or sister, are you at peace this morning? Are you trying to find peace in the wrong ways? And it's time for you to come on back home and lock it in and live and strive and continually pursue a habit of finding peace in the gospel. If that's the case and you need prayers, we're here for you. We want to help you. If you're here this morning and you're not yet at peace with God, you've not yet obeyed the gospel of Christ, you've not yet obeyed the gospel of peace, won't you make the decision to do so? Be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins, becoming a child of God. Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 and 27. Are you a child of God this morning?